Hello, everyone, and welcome to the new episode of the You Can Exhale Now. Today, I am hosting Tom DiBlasi, who has a PhD in clinical psychology and is an assistant professor at St. Joseph's College, where he studies anger, domestic violence, and revenge. And I am really excited about this conversation because for a lot of people, we try to stay positive, quote unquote, and try to ignore or suppress what we perceive as negative emotions, such as anger and thoughts about revenge. And of course, I am hoping that today Tom will be able to share with us different strategies on how to cope with these emotions, how to make sure that we let go of anger, and how to deal with life as it is in a healthy, balanced way.
Welcome to You Can Exhale Now, a mindful living podcast for the modern pace, hosted by Lesia Liu. This podcast is for anyone who wants to get more out of life without the burnout. Because when you learn to take proper care of yourself, you have more energy, a more positive outlook, and more gratitude for life. And because you cannot reach your goals if you're tired, overwhelmed, judgmental, angry, and feel sorry for yourself. Each episode, you will learn actionable strategies for self-care, mental health, productivity, better life-work balance, and happiness from coaches, therapists, and experts. Stop holding your breath. You can exhale now. Choose to be a more authentic version of yourself than you've been in a while.
Tom, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you, Lesia, and hello, everybody. I appreciate you having me on and allowing me kind of just to speak a little about anger. So I love talking about anger. I think anger is often overlooked. Even when you look at the research, for every one article published on anger, there's about 7 on anxiety and about 10 on depression, right? So even within the field, it's really underlooked, right? It's really not spoken about much. And so I think looking at anger and trying to get it out there more and recognize that it's also okay to experience emotions, right? And that every single person will experience anger, and there's some pros and cons to it, right? And so I want us to kind of think a little bit about, when we do try to cope with anger, what does that look like? There's some healthy ways and some unhealthy ways, right? First, just to speak a little about what anger is, I think that's often missed as well, right? What is anger and separating it from aggression, right? Even within the research, there's such a, misunderstanding about what anger is. So anger is like a negative psychobiological state, right? So there's arousal as well as a negative affect, right? And it usually does relate to thoughts of revenge and thoughts of demandingness. And we'll get into what that means. But an example of that is shooting on somebody, telling them what they should be doing, right? Or even telling yourself what you should be doing versus what you want, right? And it usually relates to some sort of aggressive behavior that can be verbal or motor. But when I'm talking about aggression going forward, I'm going to be specifically referring to motor aggression. Anger and aggression are 2 very different constructs, right? I think a lot of times people think you have to be, whenever you're angry, you aggress. But aggression only follows anger about 10% of the time, right? So 90% of the time, people are able to cope with their anger in a way that does not lead to physical aggression, which is great because as a society, can you imagine it's the other way around?
Right.
Be running amok everywhere. So how great is that, right? That we're not as aggressive, and there are probably ways we could deal with our anger better, right? I think one way I guess just not coping with anger actually is this idea of catharsis and letting it out through the means like a punching bag, right? So a lot of researchers looked at this catharsis hypothesis, the idea of releasing your anger by using a punching bag or hitting a pillow, right? Or even screaming into the pillow. Actually has only shown negative outcomes. It's only shown more aggression to follow, right? And that actually makes a lot of sense when we think about it for a moment. If I'm training my body to think when I'm angry to do this, to do these motor and verbal behaviors, right? Motor and verbal aggression, why wouldn't our body just start to adapt that? And maybe you can't get to a pillow one time, and so you end up punching the wall, right? And so I want to make sure we kind of come up with some better coping strategies than that.
Right, because you are strengthening that connection in your brain, right? That if you're angry, you have to punch something. Somebody has to suffer.
Yeah, that's exactly right. It actually even goes back to Pavlov's dogs, right? Which some of you may be familiar with. right? Pavlov's dogs learned when the light turned on, they got fed, right? So they started salivating. Right? And so the same thing is kind of true here. When I'm angry, I punch the pillow. And so now you've associated that bond repeatedly together. And so now your body has more of an urge to go ahead and punch, right? Much more so than before if you never even had that bond to begin with. So I think it's better if we can kind of come up with healthier ways, right? And there are many different ways we could cope with anger. We can kind of get into that a little bit.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So what are the healthier strategies to cope with anger? Because I think it's interesting to see that our society teaches us that anger is not good, anger is bad. You should try to suppress anger on one hand, right? And then there's on the other hand where we do get aggressive, that at least some people do get aggressive when they're angry and they're then being punished for it again, which makes sense in this scenario. But how do we cope with anger in a healthy way where we not try to push it away, but also do not encourage it, right? Do not learn to act on anger every time we feel this emotion?
Yeah, I mean, it's such a great question, right? So, I mean, first I'll just start by saying that any and all emotions are evolutionarily beneficial to some extent. Otherwise, they wouldn't continue, right? So we've been programmed, we've evolved over time. And so any and all emotions are helpful to some extent, right? So when you're anxious, it keeps you from, when you're anxious, let's say a fear of heights, right? When you're looking down from the Empire State Building, right? And I have a little bit of a fear of falling. So when I look down from the Empire State Building, I look down like, oh, that's quite a far drop, right? It keeps you from jumping off the Empire State Building, right? The anxiety is actually a good thing there. And so any and all emotions are like that. They all have a positive outcome to some extent, right? And when used appropriately. Depression too is like that. And I don't think a lot of people think about it this way, but depression, what you end up doing is drawing people in, right? You draw people into you and you gather more social support typically when you're depressed. People are more likely to be there for you when you're depressed than when you're not depressed in that way, typically, right? Now, there are obviously some cons to each one of these emotions as well. Anger is no different, right? When you're angry, it's feedback to your body that you don't like something, right? Or you may not like what somebody else is doing. You may not like what you're doing even, right? Mm-hmm. And so with that, right, you want to go ahead and use that information, right? But using that information doesn't mean aggressing on the other person. Okay? So, I think anger, for example, can be a primary or secondary emotion. It can be either one. Anger is very protective though, right? And when it's a primary emotion, it usually relates to a social injustice or some sort of injustice, right? So Martin Luther King Jr. was very angry and outraged, right, about the social injustices, right? And so the anger there was very functional and it fueled him, right? And so I want us to think about how our anger can be functional for us. What are the positive outcomes of our anger, right? And in what ways does it make it unhelpful? The goal of anger management, I've done quite a bit of work with anger management therapy and working with clients on probation and parole, court mandated. And the goal of anger management is never to get rid of an emotion, right? It's never to get rid of anger, but instead, how do we maybe minimize it, right? Because maybe they're experiencing high levels of anger constantly. How do we minimize it to the point where it's most functional for you, right? And so I want us to kind of keep that in mind as we're going through this. The goal is not to eliminate anger altogether because anger is helpful and functional to some extent, right? But instead, how do we go ahead and make it most functional for you? And so I think part of it is recognizing when it's being used as a secondary emotion, right? And when anger is your secondary emotion, what is the message it's telling you there as well? Oftentimes what's underlying that anger is hurt, right? Feeling pain, right? Feeling outrage that your significant other said X to you, right? Or that they cheated on you, right? Let's use that as an example. Feeling outrage that your significant other cheated on you, right? And underlying that is probably feeling a lot of pain and hurt. Right? And so it's more helpful to focus on the pain and the hurt there than it is to focus on the anger. But the anger acts as a protection for us so we're trying not to feel that hurt and that pain, right? And it pushes the other person away. So some of the helpful skills I think we can use, right? It really depends on the situation and the context. So I'm going to go ahead and list a few skills. Then we talk a little bit about more what each one is and what seems to be the most appropriate context. But all these skills can be helpful. It just depends on your goals in that moment and your values. Right? So some of these things might be avoidance and escape. Let's avoid an anger-provoking situation to begin with, right? Let's just not even engage if we don't have to. Or if you know you're about to lose your temper, go for a walk, right? Just get out of the situation, right? So avoidance and escape, right? It's similar to substance abuse. If you know that if you're in recovery and you're trying not to use, and you know there are going to be drugs at the party later, there's not going to be alcohol at the party later, let's just not go to the party, right? Or if you see someone whip out the drugs, right? Try to leave at that point. Then another strategy is PMR, progressive muscle relaxation, right? And so going back to what anger is, it's a negative psychobiological state, right? That's fueled with aggressive behaviors, motor or verbal, as well as thoughts of demangingness and thoughts of revenge, right? But the fact that it's a negative psychobiological state means that our sympathetic nervous system is activated during that time. Right? And I think we often forget that. In fact, most people are not aware that they're experiencing muscle tension while they're angry, right? Or even leading up to the anger. Most people are not aware of that. And I think that speaks to how the lack of attunement we have with our own body. But if we can go ahead and increase that using progressive muscle relaxation, right, that can be very, very helpful. Right, we can start to recognize our own internal cues, saying, "Hey, getting a little hot and bothered here, a little irate," right, and kind of using that as a tool to go forward. So PMR, progressive muscle relaxation, is really helpful. So you start to note you tense your muscles and then you relax them, tense them and then you relax them. And I can share a video on that if you like. That can help as a guide in terms of doing it for yourself. It's about 5 minutes long.
That would be awesome, and we'll include it in the episode notes below.
Great. Okay. Thank you. My colleague Mike lent it. He's much more relaxing than I am, so I like that he did the video. So some other things you could do, right, would be something called changing your temperature. I love this skill. I use it with most of my clients. I think it's phenomenal, right? There's a cool YouTube video on this as well. So when you're changing the temperature of your body, right, you can actually see your heart rate drop. Right? If you're wearing a Fitbit or something similar to that, if you hold your breath in cold water, right, particularly in cold water, so you can be by a sink, or if you can't do that, go ahead and splash cold water on your face repeatedly. If you really can't do that, and the best you can do is run cold water underneath your hands, or going in a shower, that's fine. You could do that instead. Not your hands, rather your wrists. You could do that instead. But I think that the best thing is to go ahead and hold your breath under cold water for about 30 seconds if you can. And you can actually watch your heart rate drop, right? And that acts as a cooling, starts to cool your body, right? And so it makes it more challenging for you to go ahead and act on those aggressive impulses, right? So changing your body temperature is really, really important. A lot of my clients use this, and it's so helpful for them. The hard part is remembering to use it in the moment, right? So that's always the hard part with this stuff, right? Is going and using these skills in the moment. Assertiveness training is another really helpful one. So this is great if you're trying to communicate more effectively, right? Whenever I introduce the clients, it's me being that 80 out of 100, 100 being the angriest you could be. It's me being at that 80 out of 100, but operating at a 40, okay? So we're not saying let's get rid of your anger, right? Here what we're saying is how do we communicate in the way that's most effective to get you what you want, right? How do we go ahead and tell the other person that you're feeling very hurt by what they did or said to you? Social problem solving. Anger, evolutionarily speaking, has been very narrowly focused, right? When we're angry, we focus on just the threat in front of us, right? Because you perceive it to be a threat. And so it's supposed to act as a protective mechanism against that threat. Social problem solving, right, is trying to undo that. So when we're angry, we only focus on that threat. Problem solving is trying to expand our thinking, right? Instead of going ahead and just thinking about that one threat in front of us and only hitting the person, right? We become so narrowly focused on only one option. We're also thinking about what if I were to do A, B, C, D, E, or F, right? Again, it's hard to do that in the moment. So that's why I think we'll talk about this, but putting a gap, a space in between the trigger and your initial reaction, right? And then the behavior, okay?
Mm-hmm.
Right. So with that is challenging your thoughts, right? Cognitive therapy, REBT, both of these approaches have tried to challenge your thoughts in the moment, right? And the most frequent thought is actually thoughts of demandingness, which I mentioned before. So demandingness is this idea that someone should or must or needs to or has to act a certain way, right? They must do that. And you might even apply this to yourself, right? I have to get this assignment done right now. And truthfully, why is that the case? Why do you need to get it done in that moment? The only thing you have to do in life is die, right? I don't mean that's so morbid either. What I mean is you don't have to pay taxes, right? There are consequences for that, certainly. And the government doesn't listen to me saying this, right? But you're willing to accept those consequences, right? You don't have to pay anything. You don't have to do anything in life. There are just consequences for that. Right? And we sometimes forget that, right? That you don't have to do anything. So if I were to say to you that I want you to buy me lunch, right? I want you to go ahead and get me lunch every day for the next week, right? You're going to tell me I'm out of my mind, right? And rightfully so, right? Because who am I to go ahead and tell you that? But it doesn't change the fact that I'm telling you that, right? No, you need to do it. You have to do it. You should do it. You don't have to do it, right? You're choosing to go ahead and do what you think is best for you. And at the end of the day, isn't that what everybody does, right? They choose what is best for them in that moment to live their best life. Right? You might do something for somebody else because that person really matters to you, but it's not because you need to do it or have to do it. It's because you want to do it. Right. And I think that's a big distinction. And when we can make that distinction too, that you want to do it versus you need to do it, it feels less like a chore and more fulfilling than also. Right? So I think it's sometimes hard to keep that in mind. Even the person cutting you off, right, when you're driving, they don't need to use their blinker, right? You certainly prefer it and be safer if they did, but they don't need to do it. You may want them to, and that's okay to want them to do that, right? I'd like to win $1 million, but that's probably not happening anytime soon, right? But it's okay for you to want them to do it. It doesn't mean they need to do it. So I think making that distinction is so important.
That's a very interesting perspective, because I think one thing, that almost kind of gets out of this is, especially oftentimes in the relations and families, we feel like another person has to do something for us or should act a certain way, even in their own life, right? Sometimes we say you should go find a better job, or you should not hang out with this person because they're not a good influence on you. But I think that this puts us in an interesting kind of verbal effect where we get angry and we should, like you said, all over another person. And then we only get angrier when they don't do what we expect they should do in the situations.
Yeah, you're 100% right. It's very compounding in that sense, right? And again, let's think about what anger is doing, right? It's protective. So it's keeping us away from the threatening trigger, right? And the most common reason for anger is the most common person related to anger, rather, aside from yourself, because you're the one experiencing it, is people that we like or that we love. People who are closest to us are most likely to be labeled our biggest anger triggers. Right? And so thinking about that, right, that means our romantic partner, right? That means our friends. That means maybe coworkers, people who we want to have, family members, people we want to have the close relationships with, we're incidentally pushing away, right? And so when you're yelling at the person about something, right, or thinking about revenge or telling them how you're going to take revenge, right, and using that as a threat, it does push people away. And the more we tell them that they should get a better job, right, or else, right, that's probably not going to make them get a better job, right? Even think about it for yourself for a moment, right? If someone threatens you with that, most people don't respond positively to that, right? Most people have now their own anger reaction towards that. And now it becomes a standoff of who's going to be angrier, who's going to be stronger in that sense. Right? I'm going to use stronger very loosely there, and hold their ground more, because it actually ends up being weaker, right, as a result of all that, because you end up now damaging the relationship further. Right? And that's why I think if we can go ahead and use assertiveness there, right, the assertiveness training I was just talking about, and really express how you're feeling, that ends up being a much more productive conversation than just going ahead and saying that you should get a better job. Well, why don't we unpack that a little bit, right? Why do you want the person to get a better job? Notice I said want, not need. Right? Well, it's hard for us to pay the bills. Okay, so getting them a better job, would make it easier to pay the bills. What else? I noticed that the other person sometimes feels depressed when they come home from work. They don't feel like they're very fulfilling. So I want them to feel happier. Okay, that's also a big component, right? Maybe the two of them would be happier if they had a little bit more money. The research shows up to about $75,000, right? If you make that much money, that is linked to better happiness. Beyond that, it's not linked to increased happiness, right? So maybe getting a little bit of a better paying job would make them a little bit happier, right? But thinking about that as a collective, right, where it's you and me, right, the relationship, it's focusing on the other person, is a lot less threatening, right, and is more likely to lead to the person getting a better job than going ahead and threatening them with that, right? You must get a better job. Or even like you think about a parent with kids, right? You have to do your schoolwork, right? If you say, look, I really want you to do well in school, right? So this way you can go ahead and succeed later on in life. Doing well in school is very, very important. Kids are much smarter than we give them credit for, right? They understand a lot more than we realize that they do, right? Even as infants, right? Kids are problem solving even when they're 6 months old, 8 months old, right? They're putting 2 and 2 together. They don't always get 4 when they put 2 and 2 together, but they're trying to, right? The process is still about. And so as a result, I think it's really helpful if parents can go ahead and explain some of that stuff to them, right? Hey, I want you to do this work, right? Because it's so important for you to do well in school for all these reasons, right? I want to show you what a hard work ethic is like, whatever it might be, whatever's important for you and raising your kids with, and the values you want to instill in them. But going ahead and explaining all that is going to be much more effective than saying that they should do the work. Because you know what? Maybe they'll end up doing the work, right? Because they'll listen to their parents at the end of the day for the most part. But they might resent you a little bit for it at the end of the day too. Right? So I think that's really important to keep in mind as well.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I think you brought an interesting point about difficulty of using these techniques in the moment. I think habit is a huge part of all of our lives. And, when I started therapy a while ago for anxiety, I just didn't have the habits, even though, we all know the tools, or we think we know the tools, but it's the habit of stopping in that moment, and instead of reaching for our tried and true solution, like for example, if I'm angry, I reach out to my best tool of start yelling at the other person, right, or something like that. So how can we instill this habit in us of remembering these techniques and being a little bit more mindful every time we get angry, to the point where little step by little step, it becomes easier to control our emotions and to handle them in healthy ways?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it is very challenging, right? I'm just going to say that right up front, right? I think it's especially challenging when we don't practice them every day, right? So the best way you can go ahead and do this is practice it outside of the moment. Start to make it like muscle memory. Think about a basketball player. Right? If you go ahead and shoot the basketball 100 times outside of the game, that starts to form muscle memory. So this way, in the game, you start to have the same form when you go to shoot the ball as you did in practice. Right? It's the same thing for us here, right? If you practice it outside of the moment, if you practice deep breathing, if you practice changing the temperature, even when you're not angry yet, if you practice being assertive when you're not angry, or just challenging your own thoughts, right? And looking for the evidence, right? Because oftentimes what we think is not correct anyway, right? Trying not to use demandingness, but trying to use I want. If you can practice that a little bit each day, it doesn't even have to be that long, but maybe 5 minutes each day. In the moment, it becomes so much easier to do, so much easier, right? You might even start to notice, hey, I've been practicing deep breathing or PMR, progressive muscle relaxation, every day for the past 2 weeks. And you know what? When I was angry just a little bit ago, I started to notice that my fists were tense, right? I had one client who would say that they always felt the tension in their shoulders, right? Or their left arm, which we ruled out was not a heart attack. But I think if we can go ahead and do these skills a little bit each day, that's really important. Right? And I don't want to say that we should do them for an hour each day. That's not really realistic, right? I don't want us to set ourselves up for failure. We can set ourselves up for success by saying, let me take out 5 minutes. 5 minutes in the morning, 5 minutes at night, wherever you can carve that out, maybe in the middle of a lunch break, and just go ahead and take the 5 minutes to practice these skills. Practice the deep breathing, the progressive muscle relaxation. Practice challenging your thoughts, right? Because at the end of the day, what we'd really like, the absolute end goal would be when you experience an anger trigger, being able to use deep breathing to then challenge your thoughts, put the gap in between the trigger and the behavior. So you deep breathing, challenge your thoughts and be like, you know what, my impulse right now is saying that, my original thought is saying that they did that on purpose, right? And they need to pay for that. Right? But if we can challenge our thoughts a little bit with that and instead say, you know what, I don't know if they did that on purpose. They often forget to wash the dishes. And yes, I'm a little annoyed having to remind them constantly. And that doesn't mean that they did this intentionally. So what are some other ways for me to go ahead and say this to them in a way that might be more effective to get what I want? Because being yelled at is never really, I don't say never, but will rarely get you what you want, right? So if we can combine the skills to use deep breathing or PMR, challenge your thoughts, to use problem solving, to then be assertive, that would be ideal. And some of it's contextual too, so I'm going to throw that out there. But that would be the ideal approach.
Mm-hmm. And, I'll be the first one to admit, sometimes when you get angry in that moment, you feel so self-righteous, you feel so powerful, right? Sometimes you just get so angry, you're about to explode, and yet in some weird way, it almost feels good. If you know what I mean, you feel powerful, you feel self-righteous, you feel like you're standing up for yourself finally. What do you say are the best strategies when you're in that moment where you almost want to feel angry for some reason, if it makes sense at all?
Yeah, no, I think that's a very common experience. A lot of my clients have told me that there's a study that was done, I guess it's been 26 years now, actually. So it was done a little while ago. But they found that the only emotion that people like experiencing more than anger is happiness, right? And I think that's really eye-opening, right? Happiness is the only emotion people want to experience more than anger. So there is something, although it's seen as a negative state, right? There's something reinforcing about anger, right? I think, as you call that, self-righteousness, the idea of wanting to stand up for yourself, right? I like that terminology. And so I think the best thing you could do is come up with a plan ahead of time, right? And say, you know what? I know when I'm feeling that way, right? It really feels like I'm in the right and I want to say X and Y and Z and stand up for myself. And that may not be the most helpful thing to do in that moment, right? And I think it's helpful if you can recount past experience for that to be true, right? Doesn't mean what you're feeling isn't valid. I want to put that out there. Doesn't mean what you're feeling is wrong or isn't valid. It may very well be justified, right? But the way you're about to approach it may not be the most helpful. So we can go ahead and before it even happens, plan for that. Say, you know what? When that happens, I'm going to walk. I'm going to go ahead and put water on my face, right? I'm going to leave for 20 minutes, do something I enjoy, listen to some music, and then come back. You can do something like that. Listening to funny videos, right? Humor is a great way to discount anger. Doing some of that would be really helpful. And if that anger still persists, right? If that anger is really justified, you'll still have the words for it come a half hour later, right? I'm not advocating don't say it, right? That's why I think the assertiveness comes in. I'm not advocating don't say it. I'm not advocating being passive or being aggressive. I'm advocating being assertive and sticking up for yourself in the way it's going to be the most functional for you, for your relationship with the other person, right? And maybe just the way you want to live your life.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Because I think, from my own experience, I think in that moment, even when you feel self-righteous and justified at the end of the day, then you get tired, right? And you suffer from your anger, because if that anger is really justified, then I guess you can stand up for yourself in a calmer way, right? Which sometimes can be even more powerful if you can just calmly explain the person why they're in the wrong, or calmly put your 2 weeks notice in and just be done. This is the place of work, if that makes you angry or something like that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's very much true, right? If you can explain it when you are calmer, right? I think it is more powerful, right? I think about this too with breakups, right? If you break up with someone out of a fit of rage, right? Fit of anger with the person, right? Oftentimes those breakups don't last. It's the breakups that relate to speaking when you're not angry that last more, right? Those are more likely to be persistent, where you are actually broken up. right? Because you're showing the person this is a calm level approach. And you're right. If you really are that angry about something, and if you really if that anger is really that justified, it'll still be present after, right? It'll still be present. Not the anger so much, but the justification for it. It'll still be present even after you're no longer experiencing that rage. So I think that's really important. No one's advocating for you to not stand up for yourself. I wouldn't say that. What I'm saying is let's do it in a way that's most helpful for you. Because if you and your partner are yelling at each other over something, that probably isn't always going to be the most helpful.
You don't say.
Just a thought. I don't know. Just a thought.
What about, if, let's say, anger persists in that maybe the situation happened to you a few years ago. Maybe the situation happened to you in childhood. Maybe you've had abusive parents and you haven't spoken to them, or, you haven't seen them or stuff like that. And that anger just persists inside of you and you feel like there's no way out. There's no way to face that person, to face that person who hurted us, who abused us. What do you suggest? How do you get closure, and how do you move on in a healthy way where that anger is not eating you from inside out?
Yeah, so that's just a challenging question. I think it's challenging for everyone too, right, to experience that. I think some of that's very contextual. So I'll also put that out there, right? It's challenging for people who are maybe who are victims of abuse, right, or survivors of abuse, or trauma, right? And how do you cope with that anger? There are some pretty effective therapies looking at prolonged exposure and cognitive processing therapy that are pretty helpful for that. And even afterwards, sometimes that anger still persists, even after kind of processing the trauma, right? I think one thing that is very, very helpful, and this often doesn't get received well in the beginning, so I want people, I guess, to keep an open mind to it, is the idea of perspective taking and forgiveness. Right. I think that it's actually very important. Perspective taking and forgiveness is not about the other person. Right. It's not. It's about helping you live a better life. Right. It's not about saying what the other person was right. Right. Forgiveness is not going ahead and saying, oh, it's okay what you did to me. It's not. It's not okay. Because if it was okay, we wouldn't be talking about it right now. Instead, it's going ahead and saying you're letting go of the anger for your own benefit. And that I think is very different than the way people think about forgiveness now. And so with that, I think you do several different exercises with it. I think you can go ahead and write the person a letter, right? And maybe never send it or send it. It's up to you. But kind of organizing your thoughts a little bit, organizing your emotions. I think that seems to be very helpful for a lot of clients. Another thing too is really engaging in perspective taking. So really looking at it from their perspective. Going ahead and using I statement as if you are the other person, right? And answering it like they really would, not the way you think you would answer it for them, but the way you really think they would answer that question, right? So the first thing people often say is, oh, I did X because I'm stupid, right? Well, that's probably not what people are telling themselves, right? No one really says I did X because I'm stupid, right? And think that they did was right. Instead, right, what people are going ahead and doing, right, I guess rather what would be better would be to really look at it from their perspective. So I think going ahead and challenging your thoughts in that context, looking from that perspective. And when you're looking from that perspective, think about what are their skill sets, right? Do they actually have the ability to do what you would want them to do? Not should they, right? Because let's be careful of using that language, whether that's implicit or explicit. People often use that language. It's the most commonly associated cognition with anger, right? Not should they have that ability. You might expect them to be able to have an emotional conversation, especially if they're a parent and talking to a child. But it doesn't mean that they should be able to, or that they even do, right? So let's look at it from that perspective. Do they have that skill set? Oftentimes the answer is no. Right? Oftentimes too, you can't really expect someone who doesn't know how to fly a plane to be able to fly the plane, right? So I think that's really important to keep in mind. They don't have the skill set. You can't expect that of them. Right? People often don't engage in delayed gratification. Also, people often engage in immediate gratification, right? And so they look for what's the easiest way, for them. And that's true for most people in this world. Right? And the other thing is, I think it's really important to think about one's genes and then one's learning history. Right? So if substance abuse, there's a genetic component to substance abuse and depression and anxiety, right? As well as anger. And so being able to account for that, right? Oh, everyone in their family has, or a lot of people in their family have these issues, right? So they're starting off on a different platform right off the bat. So I think that's important to keep in mind also. Right? And looking at one's learning history. So the way, what they've experienced throughout their life, right? It makes sense that, they act this way given X, Y, and Z, right? It makes sense that they are abusive given the way they were treated, right? As kids, they were abused as kids. And thinking about that, there's not quite a 1-to-1 ratio with that, but it's awfully high, right? So people who were abused are more likely to be the abuser going forward. And I really want to highlight, this is not to make excuses, right? This is not to make excuses, but rather to help one understand so that they can move forward with their life, right? And it's very much selfish focused, which I think is a good thing, right? Humans are actually innately selfish, and thank God we are, otherwise we wouldn't be able to propagate as like a species. But humans are innately selfish, and that's okay. Forgiveness and perspective taking is not selflessness, it is selfishness in a way of how do I live my best life and how to let go of this anger.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. And do you think, that forgiveness is probably the antidote to thoughts of revenge? Because, I think, again, just when you're angry and you feel self-righteous and you feel justified in your anger, you want to get back at the person who hurted you. But every major religion teaches us against revenge, right? Every major religion teaches us to forgive. Is that the biggest part of the puzzle, of the answer to this, or is there more to do and to consider when thinking about revenging?
Yeah, so every single major religion does teach us that, right? I'm actually reading a book right now. It's called Man Seeks God. It's by Eric Weiner. He writes a few other books, but essentially it's his quest for a God, and so he explores a few different religions along the way, and he's going through each one of them, and it's quite an interesting read. And as I'm reading it, I'm thinking, wow, there's so many similarities between these 8 different religions. But I think, forgiveness really is the key to it all. And I want to point out that it's so much easier said than done, right? It's so much easier said to say forgive, right, than to go ahead and to actually do it, right? I think it was Confucius, I believe, who said, throwing a hot stone hurts you, not the person you're trying to throw it to, right? And that's how we really viewed anger, right? Is going ahead and holding that hot stone, holding that anger hurts the beholder, not the person who you're trying to throw it to whom you're trying to throw it. And so forgiveness would be really, really helpful. I think challenging those thoughts, learning about the other person's life even in that way. And that can be very powerful and emotional too. I want to really put that out there, is trying to forgive the other person. I had a client who, as you're working through people who have really hurt him in his life, and it just kind of all clicked for him, he just started completely crying, right, for a good 15 minutes. And, it was very, very emotional for him to go through that. And I think that was a very moving experience. And I think that's something we're to share, right? Because I think that to really sort of put those pieces together, and he's able to realize, what, I recognize now why they did it. I don't agree with it. I don't like it, but it doesn't mean I don't have to like it. I don't have to agree with it. I can understand it. And by understanding it, it makes it easier for me to move on. Right. And so forgiveness really is very helpful with revenge, especially, incorporating the idea of the REBT there too, rational emotive behavior therapy, challenging those thoughts of demandingness. Oftentimes with revenge, it's this idea of you think you were treated unfairly or unjustly, right? So again, related to demandingness. And trying to challenge that, putting these demands on other people is really kind of the heart of the idea of revenge to begin with, right? I have to get back at them because they did X. And the implicit thought of that is they shouldn't have done X. Because if I have to get back at them because they made me a sandwich, right? Like no one says that, right? Unless there's poison in the sandwich. But, thinking about that, if we go ahead and consider the idea that our implicit thoughts are based in this idea of shoulding on the other person and challenge those shoulds, challenge those demands, right? I think it would be not only a more forgiving place, but also a much more compassionate place as well. And I think that would really kind of combat a lot of the revenge.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. So what about if you experience anger at yourself, right? Sometimes we live with regret, and sometimes we can be our own harshest critics, especially even if, like, we know we did something wrong. We've hurted somebody, whether on purpose or not on purpose, or maybe we should have known better than to do X, Y, Z. I think there is a lot of poison to live with anger at yourself. So what strategies, if they're at all different from what we've talked about, are there for dealing with anger when you're being angry at yourself for something you've done many years ago or you've done yesterday?
Yeah. So I think that a lot of the strategies would be the same, right? Trying to challenge those thoughts, right? Trying to say, why should you have done X? Why would you have known any better? I think a key component with that too is our personality and what we do is made up of our environment, right? Our genes and our learning history, right? So if anybody grew up with those genes, with that learning history and the current environment or the environment throughout your lifetime, we'd all be doing the exact same thing, right? If we all had the same genes, the same learning history, and the same context, we'd all do the exact same thing, right? And I think that's so important to remember because it allows for more compassion, not just for other people, for ourselves too, right? So let's say you're talking about, I really wish I didn't go to that college. I really wish I went to somewhere else, right? Well, you made the best decision for yourself with the information you had in that moment, right? You really wish you didn't engage in a certain behavior, right? And I can understand, looking back at it, maybe that wasn't the best behavior, but you thought it was that moment. And so to recognize that, and to give yourself the compassion that you acted in the best way you could in that moment. If you had more time to think about it, or if you were maybe in a better place mentally or emotionally for yourself, or just in a different environment, you probably would have made a different decision, right? And I think we can recognize, if we can recognize that and have that compassion for ourselves, that would be so important, right? And that'd be really, really helpful. The hard part is really believing it, right? You might logically understand it, but emotionally you might not believe it yet. And so part of it is getting that emotional insight. What can you do to get that emotional insight? The biggest thing to do is not just telling yourself those thoughts, but now acting in line with those thoughts, right? So instead of ruminating about the anger, the event, right? Instead of berating yourself for it, right? Telling yourself, hey, you know what? I acted the best way possible at that time. I'm going to write a note to myself. I'm going to write a letter to myself, just like a friend, right? Talk to yourself like you would a friend. You probably would tell that friend, hey, it's okay. Look, A, B, C, and D, right? Talk to yourself that way. Right? Because at the end of the day, we have the relationship with ourselves if we can really have a deep relationship with somebody else as well. So I think that's very, very important. I think the other thing too is just being kind to yourself, right? I think one thing I like to do with my clients is, especially people who have anger towards themselves, is to write 3 things that they like about themselves every day, right? For the next week or two, and you can't repeat, right? And you'll notice that some of them might start off a little superficial, but they start to grow because you can't repeat, right? So you can't say every single time that you like the same 3 things, but they'll start to grow, and you start to really think about yourself in a different way, and start to really notice, you know what? I do like this about me, right? I was hesitant to say this before, but the more I think about myself in a positive way, which is what you're trying to go for, the more I actually do like X, Y, Z. And so really thinking kindly about yourself, but really very importantly, putting that into action, even if you don't fully believe it in the moment, okay? Putting it into action is the most important part because that feeling will come, but it only comes if you allow yourself to engage in the behavior to let it come.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's powerful. So I would like to finish this episode on kind of a more somatic note and just talk about, as any emotion, anger is energy inside of us. I don't know if it's a little woo-woo or not, but I think there's research right now, right, about that unprocessed emotions and trauma are stored in our bodies as energy. So how would you recommend to move this energy out of us and, live more freely, live more happily, lighter, without all of this angry energy inside of us?
Yeah. I think the most important thing is living a value-filled life, right? So making a distinction between values and goals, right? So goals are things you can accomplish. Values are direction you're always heading in, right? So you might value education. You can't ever fully accomplish education. You could accomplish the goal of graduating, but you can't ever fully accomplish the goal of education, right? You can't learn absolutely every single fact there is to know in the world, unfortunately. But what you can do, right, is value education, right? You can achieve the goal of graduating. You might value family, and your goal might be to speak to them on the phone twice a week, right? Or spend time with them once a week, whatever it might be. Right? So I think making that distinction between values and goals and really trying to live that life, right? Try not to let the anger get in the way. What you'll find is even if you are experiencing some anger, some residual anger, right? If you're not letting that dictate your life, it will start to A, subside, and B, you'll start to find yourself living a fuller life, right? So if you are experiencing anger towards a family member, right? Not going to the family party is going to make it really challenging to have close relationships with other members of your family. So now your value of family, you're not really living up to that value, right? The goal might be to go ahead and go to the family party and spend time with them. But because that family member might be there, you might not want to go. But can we go ahead and use our skills and engage in those values anyway, and go to the party and try and come up with a plan to just not really engage with that person if possible. Right? That'd be the end goal, right? So not let the anger dictate our life, and we'll notice that it starts to subside. And if possible, one of the best things you could do is exercise. If exercise could be bottled up into a pill, it'd be the most commonly prescribed pill throughout the world, right? So thinking about that is exercise is awesome, right? Moderate level of exercise, particularly like aerobic exercise, kind of lets a lot of the juices out, I guess, right? So that would be a great experience also, particularly aerobics or running, yoga, any of those things.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Well, Tom, thank you so much for this episode. I think it's one of the longer episodes, but I absolutely love it. I've asked you so many questions from different angles, and you've done so well. So thank you so much for sharing all your knowledge and wisdom with our listeners today.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate you having me on here. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for listening today. I hope you've learned a lot of new strategies. Be sure to check out the notes below this episode for additional resources and tools mentioned in today's show. I would love to keep the conversation going. Share your thoughts and takeaways with me on social media channels wherever you are. And do not forget to tag me. I'm so grateful for each and every one of you, and I will see you on the next episode. If this podcast has helped you even a little bit, please leave a review and subscribe so that we can help spread the message together.